What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the Fall of X, an event you all are loving so far, and we pick up with the Dark X-Men. This is awesome, right? The Dark X-Men comic. Now, this opens up with MADELYNE PRYOR, Alex Summers, and the Limbo Embassy on Earth. Now, I'm sure those of you guys who have not been following the X-Men have no idea what any of that means. So here's the thing, right? MADELYNE PRYOR is basically the clone of Jean Grey from the X-Men. And because Marvel just didn't really know what to do with her for the last few years, they stuck her in the realm of hell, right? Limbo, whatever you want to call it. And she'd just been ruling it for a little while. Now, in a story called Dark Web, which was really, really bad, Marvel actually changed things up so that MADELYNE PRYOR rules the Limbo Embassy on Earth itself, and it's been given sovereignty, right? So like it's its own territory that really is an extension of the island of Krakoa. Now, of course, Alex Summers is the brother of Cyclops. His code name for the X-Men is HAVOK. He's been an on-again, off-again member of the team, right? So it's one of those things where he's literally just down bad for MADELYNE PRYOR, if we're being honest with ourselves. And that's where things essentially stand with their characters. Now, because of the fact that the Limbo Embassy is a de facto extension of the mutant nation of Krakoa, you have a whole bunch of protesters who were out here and who were just kind of like telling them to leave and that kind of thing. But what's really cool here is that once MADELYNE PRYOR arrived on Earth, what she did is she opened the embassy up to any and all mutants of Krakoa who were basically cast-offs. And so for anybody who is a seasoned X-Men reader, you picked up exactly what I did, which is, okay, so basically the Limbo Embassy is just a reworked version of the Morlocks in the Morlock tunnels from the old Chris Claremont X-Men days. Basically, yeah, that's effectively what it is. It's cool, right? It's a cool concept, right? But you have guys like Azazel, who's the father of Nightcrawler, so that's why they look very similar and both can teleport. And so that's why you also have mutants here that have like physical deformities, things that would prevent them from being able to just kind of walk around among humanity. Now, one of the things that MADELYNE PRYOR does as she's talking to Alex is she says, what's going on here with Orchis launching this strike against a mutant population? There's no way they wiped out 250,000 mutants at one time, because if they did, they'd be parading their corpses through the streets, or at the very least, they would be celebrating their complete and total annihilation. The reality here is Orchis has no idea where those mutants went any more than Xavier does. Now, one of the cool things she does here is she makes reference to Genosha, right? When Cassandra Nova wiped out 16 million mutants. That was nuts, right? Like that was really, really cool. But she makes reference to that and says like, I was not technically alive, right? I wasn't among the living when that whole thing popped off. So I imagine it was pretty insane for the telepathic community. But at the end of the day, we still have a means to reach out and see what mutants that exist out there are in need of our aid. She has her own version of Cerebro, right? Where Xavier would use the technological version of Cerebro in order to scan the entirety of the Earth and find mutants out there that need rescuing and that kind of thing. She's effectively doing it the same way, except she calls it the Mercy Crown, and it's kind of its own demonic entity to a degree. Now, what follows next is very reminiscent of the old Chris Claremont Days of Future Past, Project Wide Awake days from the X-Men in the 1980s. And the reason why I say that is because we pick up with a father who gets a knock on the door. And of course, when he answers the door, he ends up greeting this kid named Benny. Now, what ends up happening is Benny goes downstairs into the basement with his daughter, Buddy, which is kind of interesting. And as a father, I probably wouldn't allow that to happen. But the thing about this is that they're kind of down there doing their thing as far as the dad's concerned. He's not really paying a whole bunch of attention. But what ends up going on is Benny actually removes an inhibitor collar around their neck and is revealed to be Carmen Cruz. Now, for those of you guys who don't know who Carmen Cruz is, she's a relatively new creation to Marvel Comics. She originally appeared in a storyline called Children of the Atom. Basically, she is kind of a new generation of mutants that exist in Krakoa or are brought into Krakoa. Kind of like a young X-Men type team, right? She was even part of Bishop's War College, right? If you don't know what that means, it's not a huge deal. If you do, you understand what I'm referencing. So it's one of these things where she's basically a younger mutant out there. Now, what she ended up finding out is from a friend of hers, Gabe, who was also part of the Children of the Atom storyline and was actually just like a human masquerading as a mutant, if we're being honest with ourselves, that what he had done is he had found a guy online who was selling inhibitor collars. Now, unlike old school stories in Marvel, where inhibitor collars were designed to shut down the powers of mutants, this inhibitor collar actually hides mutants from any sentinel or any device out there that can track their location. Now, I'm sure right off the bat, some of you guys are kind of like, I'm pretty sure I know who's creating these inhibitor collars, and we may or may not find out. My guess is Forge, if I'm a betting man. Like, I'm willing to bet Forge is the one who's doing it. But what's important here is that this is an underground meeting. That's really what it is that's going on here. The issue is the father overhears it. And this is the throwback segment to like Days of Future Past, Project Wide Awake, and that kind of thing, because the on-running theme through all those stories in the 1980s was, if you see something, say something. And that's exactly what the father does. He rats Carmen out to Orcus. And so literally Orcus forces come arriving onto the scene, right? Just full bore, you know, just what looks like more or less a SWAT type system. They kind of incapacitate his daughter. And then of course they go after Carmen. They ultimately overpower her and in turn capture her and take her away. Now here's the thing. As this truck is making its way through the city, they happen to drive by an unassuming man leaning against a flagpole. And this unassuming man is the person that many of you have been asking, where is this guy? Where is Gambit? Here he is, ladies and gentlemen, and it's not just him, because immediately this truck is taken out, right? Like Gambit throws his little, you know, tire busting stars, which basically blow the place to pieces, right? Send the truck flying. Not enough to destroy it, but certainly enough to incapacitate it. Archangel Warren Worthington rips open the back door, and then Maggot of all people is a part of their team as well. Now, here's the thing. Most all of you guys know about Gambit. I'm sure most of you guys know about Archangel. Basically, he's a guy with metal wings. That's really all he is now, and he has a healing factor, right? He has a whole huge history in Marvel Comics, which we're not going to go into here. And Maggot is like the weirdest X-Man that you've never heard of. This guy, these maggots that are on him, that's how he eats, right? Like they help him to kind of maintain his existing power, but like they feed on energy from like anything and then give it to him. So you're gonna see him put those things to use here in a minute. And honestly, it's gonna be every bit as gruesome as you think it's gonna be. But what ends up happening, of course, is they remove a proper inhibitor collar that was put on Carmen, which is to say the ability to shut down her powers. And of course, what you end up getting is one of these guys, one of these Orcus agents who's still awake and starts kicking this kind of soldier who's there, telling him to wake up. At the same time, he sent out an SOS calling for reinforcements. And so what ends up happening when this agent manifests, it's a robot version of Wolverine. Specifically, it's Albert. Now, if you guys remember the old Iron Man 2020 story that we covered eons ago, Albert is a robot version of Wolverine that's been around for a very long time. He was actually created by a guy named Donald Pierce way back in the day. It was funny because it was Albert and LCD. Basically, LCD was like a little girl who was a robot that had a self-destruct protocol. She ended up becoming super smart, overrode her programming, and then her and Albert basically escaped and then struck out into the world on their own. But that's why he keeps saying Elsie. That's why he keeps saying that name, because she was basically his partner. I felt like that was a cool little bit of history and something to be aware of. But this guy is quote unquote following his program. Now, of course, he's also a little broken at the same time. He also appeared relatively recently in the Wolverine story and was presumably just kind of left defunct out there in the world in Madripoor. They ultimately ended up discovering him, and of course, Orcus is trying to work with him, but with like minimal effort, right? They're just kind of using him as a mindless robot out there. He's cool. Albert is definitely going to have a bigger role to play in the entirety of this whole Fall of X event. But what ends up happening is that in the midst of all this, with like Sentinels showing up, helicopters showing up, reinforcements arriving, honestly, the days of Gambit and his forces are effectively numbered, right? They're just an underground resistance team. That's when Azazel pops in on the scene, grabs some guys and teleports them away. And that's when Madeline Pryor makes her presence known. Now understand, for someone like Gambit, he knows exactly who Madeline Pryor is. Like, Carmen Cruz kind of understands to a degree, but she doesn't know how deep the rabbit hole goes when it comes to Madeline Pryor. And so that's why Gambit tells her, like when she asks, are they on our side? The response of Gambit is, it's complicated, right? Because with characters like Implet and Havok and Azazel and Madeline Pryor operating as an X-Men team, it can't be anything but just some reworked version of Magneto's Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. And in fact, to a degree it is, because when Madeline Pryor's X-Men show up here, they start killing everybody, and they do it with no concern or reservation. Every member of Orcus is killed. Like, you literally have guys who are being cut in half. Warren Worthington was actually stabbed by Albert, so like, he's injured. I mean, he has a healing factor and he'll recover, but like, Madeline Pryor turns a car into a demonic entity which starts consuming a guy, and so she literally tells them, no mercy, my X-Men, kill everybody. Now, the kicker about all this is that Albert stabs Havok through the neck, right? He kills Alex Summers on the spot. Now, is it a very unceremonious death of one of the longest standing mutants in Marvel Comics? Yeah, but if this tells you anything, it should be that we will likely end up seeing Havok return in some form or fashion in Marvel, right? I mean, literally, they're dragging his corpse. He's just kind of bleeding out of the neck, and hopefully Madeline Pryor can do something to keep him alive, although things look pretty bleak, right, for this guy. And so what's cool here is that you have Madeline, who's just like, okay, look, we're done, right? Like, we're basically finished here. I mean, it makes sense given like what's going on, right? Because this whole entire conflict with like the Dark X-Men fighting, this is happening in a matter like probably within less than a minute, right? It's like how fast all this stuff is happening, like giant sentinels showing up and stuff like that. You got to get out of there as fast as you possibly can, because these things have been designed to eradicate mutants. And while Madeline Pryor is not the most well-versed when it comes to like facing off against sentinels, guys like Gambit and all those folks, even Maggot, whose literal Maggot is eating an actual guy at that moment, even he's smart enough to realize we have to get out of here, because these sentinels exist to do nothing but eradicate mutants. That's it. And they will destroy us without an ounce of remorse. So ultimately, Madeline Pryor tells Azazel, we have to get out of here. The issue is Warren Worthington is left behind. That literally Madeline Pryor is just kind of like, there's nothing we can do. And so what you end up doing is picking up with Archangel at an undisclosed Orcus black site. And he's kind of brought in for what seems to be a sort of experiment. And that what goes on is we end up finding out that Orcus at this site has what's being referred to as the one true Goblin Queen. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I have no earthly clue who this is, unless Marvel is somehow shifting things up and saying that Madeline Pryor is not the actual Madeline Pryor that we know. This is the real Madeline Pryor, and she's been crazy and in hell and a demonic force this entire time. That seems to be what's going on. The only other alternative here is that what Orcus is doing is they're mutating and restructuring mutants. In this particular instance, that thing that's standing behind her, the feet look remarkably close to Nightcrawler. So I don't know exactly what it is that Orcus is doing, but it looks like they're creating their own kind of warped and twisted mutant versions. Very similar to what we saw Sinister doing in the Sins of Sinister event. But with that being said, guys, if you want to get caught up on Fall of X, make sure you click this link to our playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.